Welcome to the inaugural section of the International Law and the 2020 Election Series, where we'll consider a question very much on all our minds as the election approaches: the legal and security implications of foreign interference in the U.S. elections, viewed from the perspectives and policies of the 2020 U.S. presidential candidates. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session, Chimène Keitner, my colleague and friend, and the Alfred and Hannah Fromm Professor of International Law at UC Hastings Law. Hi, Chimène.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and thank you, Mark, and the whole team at the American Society of International Law for bringing us all together. Thank you so much to our panelists. You'll get to hear a lot from them in the next hour, and I really can't think of three better people to bring such a rich variety of perspectives to today's conversation about cyber threats and election interference. And given that this morning we're recording on August 18th, the unclassified version of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence's report getting into additional aspects of the 2016 interference from Russia in our presidential election, it certainly gives us lots of food for thought. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, and then we will turn to our discussion. I'm delighted to have Susan Benesch with us today. Susan is the founder and executive director of the Dangerous Speech Project. This project studies how to make divisive rhetoric less likely to spark violence while protecting freedom of expression. Among other affiliations, Susan is a faculty associate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. She was profiled in the Washington Post in October 2016 under the headline, "This professor devotes her life to countering dangerous speech. She can't ignore Donald Trump's." And Susan's interest in speech dates back to her first career as a journalist. So Susan, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I'm also so delighted to welcome Carrie Cordero, who's the Robert M. Gates Senior Fellow and General Counsel in the Center for New American Security. Carrie has served in government, including as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for the National Security, and as Senior Associate General Counsel at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And both Carrie and Jamil have titles that are mouthfuls, but if you listen carefully, they've been positioned in really core key government positions that give them such unique insight into the problems we'll be discussing today. Carrie has testified before Congress, including in a June 2019 House Judiciary Committee hearing on lessons from Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report on public interference in the 2016 presidential election. And I should note, for Susan's Dangerous Speech Project, you can find a lot of their wonderful research online, and you can also find Carrie's testimony from that 2019 hearing online as well. Last but certainly not least, we have Jamil Jaffer joining us today. He's the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute, and an assistant professor of law at George Mason University. Among other affiliations, he serves on the executive committee of international law and national security for the practice group of the Federalist Society. So we're so delighted to have another international lawyer on the call, in addition to our other wonderful experts. He has also served in government, including as chief counsel and senior advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security in the Department of Justice, and associate counsel to President George W. Bush. So thank you so much, Jamil, again, for joining us. And we have, as of today, 77 days to go before the November 3rd election. I'm going to start us all off on a real high note here and ask what worries each of you the most about what could unfold in the short months to come. Susan, can I invite you to go first, and then we'll invite our other panelists to weigh in.
Yes, I'm happy to, and thank you so much for this opportunity to discuss with such magnificent colleagues. I am worried in a way that, of course, I never imagined only a relatively short time ago. There are very powerful forces inside and outside of this country bent on increasing fear in our population and particularly fear of each other. In other words, increasing the not only polarization of the American electorate, but also the fear of roughly speaking, one side of the other in both directions. This has already been quite successful. The stakes are getting higher every day. And we have seen that such efforts, particularly online, can be very successful. Some foreign efforts during the 2016 campaign actually succeeded in drawing people out to a completely ginned up protest offline. So I fear that similar things will happen, and that it will be very difficult to react quickly enough to forestall the harms that they can engender.
Thank you, and I'll definitely be coming back to you to get a sort of a more concrete sense as well of what are the sorts of harms that we can anticipate. But before we do, Carrie, what is worrying you the most right now?
I think where we are right now in August of 2020, what I'm most concerned about is public confidence in the election, and arguments that are coming from many, many different directions that are harming that confidence in the election. And I mean that with respect to both public confidence in the administration of the election and the fair administration of the election. In other words, the sentiment that that everyone in the country feels like this American election is going to take place equitably and fairly. And then second, confidence in the actual outcome. There's so much dialogue going on right now and so many actual activities going on right now that are, I think, contributing to an environment that is creating distrust in the actual outcome, so that no matter what happens, when we get the result, I'm concerned that there will be a significant portion of the country that will not have confidence that the result was achieved in a fair way and that it is a real result. I think there's two main things contributing to that environment. One is continued foreign interference, although I don't think that we yet have a good enough handle as to whether the scope of that foreign interference is quite as extensive as it was in 2016. And I think we can talk more this hour about steps the intelligence community is taking to provide more information publicly. And then second, obviously, the pandemic is creating many, many challenges at the state and local level to be able to administer the election. And then when we layer on top of those two, one, an external threat, the second, a public health crisis, those two things are coming together. And then on top of that, we have political rhetoric significantly from the president that is also taking steps to undermine the fair administration of the election. And so I'm worried about this toxic combination.
Oh, thank you, Carrie. And again, I feel a little bit guilty eliciting such gloom and doom concerns from everybody, since we all are around the world and so many ASIL members are in different parts of the world, confronting, as you said, both political crises and public health crises that are intertwined in really harmful ways. So Jamil, after you've heard all of that, what are your biggest concerns about the next couple of months and what we could see if we don't take concrete steps to prevent it?
Gotta unmute. Always gotta remember that on our Zoom calls.
Gotta happen at least once, yeah.
Gotta happen at least once. It might as well be me. Well, Chimène, thanks for having me, and thanks to the association for putting this event together, and thanks to Susan and Carrie for being here. I mean, look, I share the same concerns that Susan and Carrie have. Just to not to put too fine a point on it. We've got nation states that were active in our elections last time around. The Russians obviously were very engaged in attempting to, and successfully, frankly, creating chaos and discord amongst the American populace. Regardless whether you agree or disagree with the intelligence community's conclusion that the Russians sought to assist President Trump in his election efforts, what is clear is that they have successfully created the kind of discord that not only called into question the 2016 elections and the results of that election, but called into question the entire presidency of this president, and essentially hamstrung Congress for the last 4 years from doing any real effective legislating, and hamstrung the president from really getting anything effective done, even in the context of a major pandemic and all sorts of chaos around the globe, including additional aggressive activities by our foes in Iran, additional aggression by China against Hong Kong, involvement in the Taiwan elections, building additional military capabilities in the South China Sea, and not to mention Russia's continued aggression against its neighbors in the Ukraine and the like. And so we've seen the world get more dangerous around us. The U.S. government, both the president and Congress, have been largely unable to respond both to the pandemic effectively as well as to these other activities because of the chaos caused by the Russians. I predict that what we saw in 2016, if 2020 isn't worse, I think there's every reason to think it will be worse. I think we will call the 2016 elections the most effective covert influence operation in history, period, full stop. And then you look at what's going to happen in 2020, right? And Carrie's exactly right. The president is making it substantially worse by his constant discussion of the elections as likely to be one of the most potentially malign influenced in history because of the mail-in ballots and the like. Again, he's not talking about foreign influence. He's talking about the problems with mail-in ballots and the like, the things that he sees as a problem. But he himself is undermining confidence in the election system, creating a fertile environment for foreigners to come in and get involved. Of course, the pandemic does more of that also by creating an environment where the American populace is not pleased with the response they're getting from their government. They're increasingly concerned about the effect it's having on their economic and personal lives, with all of our kids going back to school, almost all virtually. Parents are home, working from home, and dealing with children, right? They're under economic stress because they may or may not have jobs. That, again, is a fertile environment for foreign nation states to get in and raise questions about the effectiveness of the government, the effectiveness of rule of law institutions, and the effectiveness of the election system. I worry least about actual involvement at the polls and sort of manipulation of votes. I think that is a very hard thing to do, given the proximity you have to voting machines, frankly, the diversity of voting machines that we have across the country in various jurisdictions, and the kind of influence you have to have on individual precincts and the like. And frankly, the fact that I think our nation-state opponents recognize that type of influence might actually cross the line to something that we would really effectively respond to. So I worry less about that. I do worry at some level about the voter databases and the potential for nation-state or other actors to try to hijack them through ransomware attacks. You've heard Chris Krebs at DHS talking a lot about that. There's been a lot of good work done with DHS and the states. Tons more that could be done, a lot more money that could be spent, and unfortunately, we're not going to get to that point because it's just too late. But I worry a lot about this election system. I worry about the outcomes of the 2020 election, regardless of how it goes, because the president and, frankly, both sides have made it very clear that regardless of what happens in the elections, they're likely to challenge the outcome. Right? President Trump wins, the Democrats will challenge it. If Joe Biden wins, President Trump will challenge it. So we'll see a long timeline before the election gets resolved.
So it sounds like you've given us kind of a continuum, right, of concerns, right? And if it's sort of fair to characterize, I think you did a nice job sort of dividing up for us. There's the kind of internal dissent concern, dissent is the wrong word, internal discord, right? That is been stoked by various methods of foreign interference that we can get into in a bit more granular fashion. But it's interesting that it sounds like you are less concerned, as you said, about the actual infrastructure of our election at a state and local level in terms of the ability of results to be tabulated accurately. I mean, I suppose there's a whole other question about access and ability to vote and the capacity of the post office to actually deliver ballots, things like that. But from the perspective of what foreign governments may be trying to do and their means that they're choosing to effectuate their results, it sounds like these covert influence operations are the ones that you feel have been most successful and that they're most likely to to try to pursue. And Carrie, I'm wondering, is that from your perspective, are you also most worried about the effect of these covert operations and less worried about, say, physical election infrastructure, or where would you, after having identified your number one concern as distrust in the results, would you also extend that concern to other kind of nuts and bolts aspects of the election, or are you also more confident that the current administration is at least doing a better job trying to secure those?
Well, I think that state and locals, and with some federal assistance, Jamil mentioned CISA in DHS, which has been working a lot with the state and locals to try to bring better security to the election. I think state and locals have done a lot since 2016 to try to improve, but frankly, I'm somewhat disappointed that more hasn't been done. And I think more hasn't been done because there was no presidential executive branch leadership. I don't want to say no federal leadership, because I do think that there are individual components of government, some portions perhaps of the Director of National Intelligence, some components perhaps in the Department of Homeland Security that have tried to provide greater federal leadership, but there was no administration support of election security legislation. There's been no election security legislation passed since 2016, which I think is a real disappointment and lost opportunity. So I feel like there is more that could have been done to provide greater security. One example, and this also blends into the confidence point, there still are some states that don't have paper ballot backups, which is just a widely recognized thing that can be done to be able to audit the outcome of the election. And so it's the lack of that, I won't even say technical because it's so rudimentary, but that practical measure that could be taken that could have done so much to foster confidence in the outcome, because there would be an auditable record. Remember, the investigations that have been conducted of 2016 election interference have said that the intelligence community didn't think that there had been foreign interference in the actual electoral systems. But the reports, and this is prior volumes of the Senate report, also went to great lengths to say that if there had been, they wouldn't have known. And I don't think that we have done enough at the state, local, or federal level to be able to fill that knowledge gap of, well, if a foreign country really tried to manipulate something more in the electoral system, would we even know? And I have to say on that point, I don't have a lot of greater confidence now than I did in the past.
Thank you. And actually, just to stick with you for a moment, I think for our international audience, but especially those of us also listening here at home, just as a refresher, it may seem odd to folks that actually the state governments are really in charge of creating and supporting and monitoring the election infrastructure in each state, even for a federal level election. At the federal level, you mentioned the executive branch and sort of the current lack of leadership on these issues. What role could Congress play, or should Congress be playing ideally? And again, just to refresh everyone's recollection, especially for our international listeners, we've got a two-chamber Congress at the moment. Since 2018, the House of Representatives has had a majority of Democratic representatives, and the Senate, the upper chamber, has had a majority of Republicans. What would you expect, and is this a partisan issue in Congress, and should it be?
Well, I certainly don't think that election security and protecting the election from foreign interference should be a partisan issue, although it seems like it has, become that way, which is unfortunate. I mean, it used to be, I think to some extent in the modern era, those of us who worked in the national security space often talked about the national security consensus, that when it came to national security issues, which protecting the integrity of the election from foreign interference is a national security issue, that there was a decent amount of consensus between political parties that could be reached to be able to better protect the country. And on this issue in particular, because the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election became so politically polarizing, election security legislation even have stalled, or other legislative proposals that have been put forth over the last several years, things like labeling ads and things that pertain to what more that the social media companies could have done. I mean, none of that has seen any, none of that actually was able to be implemented in terms of election. Now, you mentioned, and I'm glad you mentioned our international audience, because the United States does have state and local administration of the elections, that does actually provide, from a security perspective, a little bit better security. So in some ways, it's that federalized system that we have where not every single election is conducted the same way or administered the same way, and there's different systems at the state and local levels. That actually, from a cybersecurity perspective, provides a little bit more protection, because there's not one way in to America's elections from a malign cyber perspective. But certainly the federal government could have provided more, and I'm from the administration perspective, could have provided more leadership, could have supported these legislative packages, provide more resources for state and locals. Much like the pandemic, state and locals are so much on their own when it comes to being able to protect the country and protect the conduct of their elections. But it's also an area, I'll just add this, it's also an area where state and locals are very protective of their authorities to manage their own elections. So there is resistance there from having too much federal input and involvement in the electoral process.
Well, I'd love to turn to Susan in just a moment to kind of get a perspective of what it must be like for international observers looking at the United States and what's going on in our electoral system at the moment. But before I do, Jamil, could you indulge us in just a little 101 of kind of which key institutions you think would normally be, or maybe are, leading a response in terms of actual election integrity, since you've obviously got experience both in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Intelligence Committee. Where would you ordinarily expect these kinds of initiatives to be coming from? And do you have a theory on why we're not seeing that from Congress, if not from the executive branch?
Yeah, and do you mean a response or like pushback directly against the nation states that are conducting these attacks? Is that what you're talking about in particular?
Well, why don't you, I guess, so in the first instance, identifying what's going on,
Right.
and as Carrie mentioned, publicizing what's going on to the extent possible, and then sure, let's get into a little bit of our international law. What responses could and should the U.S. take if we do identify attempted or successful interference?
Sure. Look, I think Carrie's right that, when you're talking about election infrastructure, it really is sort of that, as you and Carrie discussed, that shared federal state responsibility. And so in that sense, probably CIS is the first to identify that type of election manipulation, or at least defensive measures they might take against that kind of action.
What that acronym is.
Yeah. That's the new agency that does cybersecurity and infrastructure security within the Department of Homeland Security. The Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, I believe, is the name. It's run by Chris Krebs, who is the Assistant Secretary for Cyber under DHS before CISA was created as its own sort of entity within DHS. So that's sort of the first, I think, line of defense. They're the ones out there today working most directly, I think, with the state and locals, and would be the first, I think, to identify, or if there were indications to the intelligence community, right, it's likely those would be routed to CISA for dealing with, at least on the home front and on the defensive side, right? Of course.
And that sits within the Department of Homeland Security, which was an institution, an agency created post 9/11, to try to consolidate domestic responses to foreign attacks. And Carrie and the Center for New American Security have done some really great work on suggesting reforms for that agency. And I guess our last understanding, right, from an Inspector General report is that we're not even sure we have a lawfully appointed head of that agency at the moment. But this is the agency that Chris Krebs' organization lives in, right? If I understand correctly.
That's exactly right. And in fact, there's some debate on whether Chris Krebs, being one of the most senior confirmed Senate officials, might be actually the acting Secretary of Homeland Security because of all the confusion about the way the executive orders and various annexes were dealt with. So
exactly
right.
Surprise to him, right?
Yeah, it would come as a surprise to him, I think, and I'm not sure he wants that job.
So where should we see, in addition to that agency's role, where would we expect to see proactive and then responsive actions from the U.S.?
Sure. Both the FBI and NSA can provide technical assistance, right? The FBI on the investigative side, if there's an attack or a breach on U.S. soil, the FBI would almost certainly have lead investigative responsibility. Although other agencies, U.S. Postal and Secret Service, sometimes play a role in cyber events. Also, the FBI would have the lead investigative role. And then on the defensive side, I think NSA and its technical capabilities oftentimes provides leverage to DHS and other agencies, and directly to states and locals where needed, because they've got the depth of knowledge about what foreigners may be doing to our systems. And then if you think about pushback, right, and you think about what the government might do to respond and sort of deter further action or going forward action from or take action against somebody who's actually engaged in election manipulation or interference. Obviously, that could be a whole of government approach, but sort of on the sharp end of the cyber sword, right, would be the United States Cyber Command, right, the new part of Department of Defense, not new-ish now anymore, but the sort of the lean forward part of the Department of Defense that has offensive authorities, including, by the way, authorities granted by Congress specifically to respond to election-related threats, and specifically related to 4 countries, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. And so specific authority granted to them, as well as some authority cleared out of the way where there were discussions about whether a cyber command could engage in operations that were sort of clandestine in nature or not publicly attributed. That underbrush has largely been cleared out by Congress about 2 years ago. So that's an open space. And then, of course, you've got the usual government responses from the bully pulpit of the White House, which has obviously been completely ineffectual to date on these issues. But you've got the State Department that could make public statements, and then sanctions authorities at Treasury and the like that have been used fairly aggressively by this administration when it comes to China. You might see some of those being utilized, and Congress can play a role by calling attention to some of this, calling it out, and the like, as they have in this series of reports coming out of the Senate Intelligence Committee, as you mentioned, one released just today.
Well, and let's talk just a little bit more about geopolitics before turning to Susan, because you mentioned, more aggressive response to China. And in fact, I guess a little more than a week ago, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien on CBS's Face the Nation said that Chinese hackers were targeting actually our election infrastructure, and that China's goal was, quote, to see the president lose. Other U.S. officials, according to the Wall Street Journal, have expressed skepticism about that claim. In the meantime, we have the president not only being ineffectual or not using what you called his bully pulpit to really make clear that foreign interference attempts are not only unlawful under U.S. law, for sure, under international law in certain cases, but in fact, retweeting just yesterday, I think, an audio link that U.S. intelligence officials themselves have described as being part of a Russian campaign to denigrate Joe Biden. So, who should, if not the president, who would you expect to be both rhetorically and, practically trying to, create greater public confidence about our election results? Where should the Senate be in all of this, in your view, or where would the Senate that you worked with have been on these issues, if you can hypothesize?
Yeah, I mean, look, part of the challenge is leadership comes from the top, and we don't have that today, right? To the contrary, the president has gone out of his way to undermine what will be the results of the 2020 election by calling them into question already well ahead of time, and frankly, by giving the Russians a pass largely since 2016 on their very clear interference that took place back then, even calling into question the reports of his own intelligence community, prompting the members of his intelligence community to then hold a press conference at the White House, right, with sort of all the leadership talking about how the Russians did in fact interfere in the elections, and that was a unanimous view of the intelligence community. And so, you'd expect them to stand up, but of course we've had significant changes in the leadership of the intelligence community just of late. And so the president now has John Ratcliffe in office as the DNI, right? So the DNI's office, is whether they'll get involved or not is open to question. At the Department of Homeland Security, as we pointed out, you have an acting secretary who's obviously caught up with all the stuff that's happening with George Floyd and the killing of George Floyd and the reaction to that out in Portland and Seattle. By the way, that is an important thing to talk about too, is that the killing of George Floyd And the response or lack of an effective response to the federal government has also created a very fertile environment for foreign interference, right? You see the Chinese foreign ministry overtly talking about how concerned they are about the role and the situation of black individuals in the United States, black citizens in the United States. And of course, we know for a fact that the Chinese government does not care about the plight of black Americans. They're interning 1 million Muslims in the Xinjiang province, right? So this is not a country that cares. If they're doing it overtly, you can be assured that they're also engaging in the same type of manipulation covertly. And this is a nation, by the way, I do believe the Chinese are going to be influential in this election, attempt to get involved. They did it in Taiwan very recently. They didn't succeed, but they did. They were very clearly involved in that election. And so this is right out of their playbook. They saw what happened to the Russians with respect to the 2016 elections, which was almost nothing other than what Congress imposed in limited sanctions. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Chinese do get involved.
So Susan, I'm sure you have so much to say about these issues, and that was actually a wonderful jumping off point. You know, China chastising the United States, you know, and appropriately for our human rights record, but at the same time, of course, doing so from a position of great hypocrisy. What do folks that you're talking to make of what's going on in the United States right now from the perspective of a country that, you know, historically at least, in many respects, has at least held itself out as a model of democracy, of inclusion? How are our international partners and allies supposed to process all of this? And how is the, you know, hearing our co-panelists here talking about a president who's preemptively delegitimizing election results probably sounds like something that you would, up until recently, have associated with other countries that you've studied and worked on.
Or worked in. I can't help recalling the dozens and dozens of elections I covered as a young journalist in countries that were trying to achieve a peaceful transition from one government to another. And again, I have to say, I really did not imagine, in spite of Bush v. Gore, that I would, this far before an election, have this much doubt about how it would go. And of course, many of our colleagues abroad, colleagues and interlocutors, are watching with the same amazement. It recalls for me a very good article in the Irish Times a couple of months ago, long, thoughtful piece in which the journalist wrote that the United States has inspired many attitudes and emotions around the world for, of course, its whole existence. But that one sentiment that, in his view, had never predominated before was pity. He said, now there are many people abroad who look at the United States with a and in particular at its population with a feeling of pity. Talking with colleagues abroad, I hear from them that they are surprised and dismayed that American democratic institutions do not seem to be withstanding the attacks to which they've been subjected anywhere near as successfully as one might have imagined. And secondly, although here maybe I'm adding a bit of my own view, the American populace and electorate views those institutions with perhaps even more skepticism than they deserve. However, in a democratic system, the institutions and the law and the public's perception that those institutions and law are reliable and will continue to endure and function as they should are self-reinforcing elements. So that if the public loses faith in the institutions and law, then that itself would seem to undermine those law and institutions. And as I say, I confess that that's another concern of my own. I do hear it also echoed in conversations with colleagues abroad. I want to add just one bit, however, the tendency of foreign governments to seize on egregious human rights violations in the United States to fend off any criticism of their own human rights records is very long-standing. For example, as a very young person, I was in Cuba during the Rodney King episode and the riots that followed, and I remember being on a bus in Havana, and the very old, very thin woman, when she understood that I was American, gripped my forearms and begged me, "Stay here, little one," she said, "stay here, we'll take care of you." And she had that perception of the United States as a country falling apart and in universal riots, because of course the riots in LA were being broadcast on Cuban television more or less 24 hours.
And I'm looking forward to turning to Carrie in a minute to talk about the resiliency of our democratic institutions and a piece that she's actually just put out with Claire Finkelstein about what we can be doing now. But Susan, before we do that, let's take the opportunity to talk a bit about the social media environment. It's something that you mentioned in your opening remarks, that our other panelists have mentioned. Dangerous speech presumably is nothing new. Electoral challenges are nothing new. Partisanship is nothing new. Is this really a difference, the information environment that we're in now and its capacity to be weaponized, to sort of use that term, both, I think, as you mentioned in the introduction, by foreign adversaries, which of course is the biggest concern of our national security community, but also domestic groups for a variety of reasons. It's unfair to ask you to do this in sort of a kind of a short little primer, but what are the core issues that you see? Because it seems to me that we've, as international lawyers, often thought of kind of human rights issues over here and national security issues over there, and the national security bucket has gotten bigger and bigger. It started to encompass things like climate change, and appropriately so. But in a way, I was thinking this morning, it's almost that we can actually think of the reverse, of the human rights bucket now encompassing national security issues, because freedom of expression questions are now going to the heart of the ability of our populations, both confidence in elections and participation in those elections, to yield a result that will be conducive to a peaceful transfer of power. So what would you like our listeners to sort of take away or to think about in terms of the role of social media and the relationship between the government and social media? And I'm sorry for such an unfair question.
It's enormous and highly provocative and fascinating, therefore a terrific question. Let me do my best. First of all, I think one of the most interesting pieces of research between 2016 and now on what happened during the 2016 campaign is a marvelous book by some people at Harvard, Yochai Benkler, Rob Ferris, and several others, on how Americans got their news during that electoral campaign, and in particular from whom they got their news and with whom they were communicating more broadly, but particularly where they got their information. This is an absolutely critical question. And the most striking finding among many in this brilliant report was depicted in a data visualization that showed that people who are liberal and, let's say, moderate existed in roughly one cloud. And then everybody who was, I've got my hands in the wrong direction, anybody who was quite far right all the way to extremely far right represented an almost totally separate cloud of nodes and influencers communicating with one another, and almost not at all with the rest of the people online who also are, after all, the electorate then and now. It was shocking. It was really depicting two separate worlds, which leads me, and this I think is one of the greatest challenges. I spoke about polarization. We discuss it and we agonize about it. It is quite terrifyingly real and acute. And this leads me to another related point in response to your multi-pronged question, which is that when we ask what's going on online and what is of concern online, I think it's very important to distinguish between what is happening in the spaces where people with extreme views who are already susceptible to radicalization of various kinds, and in particular to incitement to violence. What's happening in those spaces and among those people is one question. And then a different, also very important but distinct question is, what is happening among the majority? And I think the greater shift is the latter, where discourse, and of course I have to say immediately that I don't have data to support this. It is unfortunately a subjective and anecdotal impression, but I work hard to make it at least an educated one. My sense is that what is sometimes called the Overton window, or the collection of statements, of words, of discourse that are generally considered acceptable, has changed significantly. We can see this, of course, in what the president says, but it is by far not limited to that. Language that demonizes other groups of people in very stark ways has become more acceptable among more groups of people. Suggestions that the United States can't conduct an election successfully have become much more common. And of course, I don't blame this on what I would call dangerous speakers. I hear that among my friends. And it's quite rational, after all. That emerges, as Carrie pointed out, from what we have seen regarding the pandemic. We have watched governments and institutions fail egregiously on many levels to respond properly to the pandemic. So it isn't that surprising that many people in the United States and abroad doubt that this country can conduct a national election competently. However, stop for a moment and think about it. That it's staggering that has become a normal thing to say and to worry about. That represents, in my view, a big shift since 2016.
Thank you so much for that. And when I circle back, maybe we can talk a little bit about prescriptions that flow from that, and what we can and should be doing. And so, Carrie, to turn the microphone over to you in this sort of more prescriptive frame, what should we be doing? What can we be doing now? And I guess maybe you can get a little bit more granular for us on the we. So, we as, those of us here on this call, we in terms of those listening to our conversation, and then these different institutions we've talked about, the executive branch, we've mentioned Congress, and Susan in her remarks mentioned the Bush v. Gore case. The courts, of course, have also been called upon to play a role in trying to help shore up the other branches and their democratic functioning. So I'll really leave it to you to sort of what part of this landscape you think is most important to address, but what should we be focusing on now, and what would your advice be for those who are in a position to take concrete actions to counteract some of those concerns that we've expressed so far on this call?
Thanks so much, Chimène. So I'm going to take this opportunity. Thank you for mentioning the piece that Professor Claire Finkelstein and I recently wrote. And I'm going to take this opportunity to plug this commentary series that we've produced. So this is part of a joint project from the Center for New American Security, my organization, and Penn Law's Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, and the Annenberg Public Policy Center. And we have created a commentary series. And the first piece was Claire and Mine's, which came out last week. there are two pieces that are out today from Nina Jankowicz on disinformation, who studies disinformation, and Eric Ratberg. And those are both those, I mention them because they might be of interest to our international viewers, in particular because they focus respectively on disinformation in Poland and lessons from Europe on countering foreign interference. And then we're looking forward to featuring your piece, Chimène, in the coming weeks as well, that covers international law angles. And so, and those are available on the CNAS website. In the piece that Claire and I, Professor Finkelstein and I launched to start off this series, we do offer some prescriptive things that can be done. And I want to focus, I'm going to list them, but I want to focus on one of them in particular, which pertains to intelligence community transparency. So we talk about things that the social media companies can be doing more of. And just in the last few days, I did see a new initiative launched by some of the social media companies. I talked earlier about paper ballot backups, which is a very rudimentary thing, but still we haven't seen every state do them since 2016. Another thing that we talk about, and Jamil touched on this earlier, is consequences for foreign actors who engage in foreign interference. There have been virtually no consequences for the Russian interference in the 2016 election. And one thing that Claire and I urge is some political consensus, because as we've talked about, Chimène, this should be a bipartisan or nonpartisan national security area of consensus that there should be consequences for malign foreign interference in our election. And two, as a matter of policy, why aren't we saying what they are? I mean, let's provide a little bit of information to warn off those who are seeking to interfere in our election. A fourth area is media responsibility. And that is, one of the areas that we saw in 2016 was this, and this has come out, there's new interest in this issue again today, given the release of the SSCI report. But the WikiLeaks releases of information, the hack and dump that the Russian intelligence services engaged in 2016, took advantage of our free media environment. And so one thing that I really hope we see between now and November is some real effort on the part of credible media organizations to really understand where information is coming from and not be used or manipulated by foreign intelligence services that might engage in some future hack and leak operation. So that's an area of media responsibility. I want to focus for a second, then, if I can have another minute, on intelligence transparency, because this is where I've spent a lot of my interest lately. So in the 2016 election, there's lots of reasons why this happened, but in my judgment, the administration at the time was very slow to release information publicly about what they were learning from about the July 2016 time period through leading up to the election. And it was in October of 2016 that there was a joint DNI and Director of National Intelligence and Department of Homeland Security public intelligence assessment. But that was very late. It was only a month before our election. There was a lot of other stuff going on in the news, and it really didn't seize the public in a way that impacted how the public understood what was going on. I have urged since then, and Claire and I discussed this in our piece as well, greater transparency from the intelligence community about foreign threats to the election. And we are starting to see the intelligence community take steps in this direction. So just within the last couple weeks, the National Counterintelligence Security Center, which is a component within our Director of National Intelligence, which sits atop our entire intelligence community, has released more public information. So it was a statement that described current, present Russian interference activity, and it also discussed preferences that the intelligence community is seeing from China and Iran, and some potential more in the propaganda category versus actual interference activities by those countries. Immediately, there was all sorts of different reactions to that transparency. Some observers that I saw in our policy community were very negative about the report because it included not just information of Russia, but information about Iran in China that was not necessarily on the same level of activities as the Russian activities. And so some observers felt that this statement by the intelligence community was perhaps massaged politically or was not being as forthcoming as possible. My urging is that the intelligence community be more transparent, that they make sure they are briefing candidates equitably about foreign threats to the election. There is an order of operations that has to take place, so the intelligence community isn't independent of the executive branch. They do have to communicate these threats through the appropriate channels, even if that means all the way up to the president, but they also have responsibilities to report to Congress, and I think they need to be more forward-leaning in the information that they provide to the public. What we absolutely cannot afford is to have to wait 4 years for a 5-volume, thousands of pages report. As much as I respect the Senate Intelligence Committee for doing that report and think that they are making a valuable historical contribution, we cannot wait for that investigation and report to take place before the public understands what's happening. And so I just urge the intelligence community to continue on the path that I do think they are on, to continue to try to provide more transparency about the foreign threats between now and November.
Thank you so much. And I know that you've been getting the message out, and I certainly hope it lands. And Jamil, I saw you nodding from various points when Carrie was talking there, and I'd love to get your perspective on not only what government actors should be doing, but additionally, if those of us in the both American and international public can or should be doing something now to be more aware of the threats that are out there. And then maybe you could amplify just a little bit. Carrie mentioned propaganda, and that's not something that we traditionally think of course, as violating international law, although we certainly need to educate our population to be resilient and to be able to identify foreign propaganda efforts so as not to become prey to them. But where do you see that line being drawn, and where would you like to see a more effective response, even potentially in the next 77 days?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the government has to get much more aggressive about deterring this type of activity and making it clear that we won't stand for this this type of election interference. And I do think that this type of covert influence operation, whether through overt propaganda or through covert influence operations, and whether those covert influence operations are purely Russian or Chinese created or simply amplifying existing discord in the United States, right? We've seen a lot of stuff going around the COVID situation, as well as the Black Lives Matter situation and the killing of George Floyd. We have seen foreign influence operations seeking to amplify existing divisions in the country. So I think that the government has got to make clear that it will respond. And the U.S. Cyber Command has gotten more authorities and has taken a more proactive approach when you hear about what they call persistent engagement, right, or defend forward, right, and that's great, right. But let's be honest. If all we did in the 2018 elections is what's been leaked out publicly thus far, which was essentially a DDoS attack against the Internet Research Agency. I mean, it's like the 1980s call to want their 300 baud modem back. I mean, let's get serious, let's get real, and let's fight this battle aggressively. You're not going to deter the Russians or the Iranians or the Chinese or the North Koreans through activities that are handled under the cover of night in intelligence channels. That's not going to deter anybody. You have to deter by seeking to be deterred and by making the enemy pay a price, right? They are making us pay a price every day. We're having these sessions because the Russians were very effective at influencing our elections the last time around, and they're going to do it again. And so it's, until we can respond in a way that they're feeling the kind of pain that we're feeling, it's not going to be effective. And so I think that's number one.
Yeah, but from an international law perspective, Jamil, let me just press you a little bit. On this defending forward point. So you mentioned denial of service attacks on the Internet Research Agency, for example, and it's fairly clear that U.S. capabilities are quite extensive in terms of ability to interfere in other countries' networks. And again, this is equally unfair as the question I posed to Susan, because it could be a discussion in and of itself, but what are the parameters that you see that might be constraining U.S. action, not as a matter of domestic authorities, but international law? Are you concerned about the reciprocity implications of maybe taking further retributory measures in the cyber realm, as opposed to doing at least what publicly we've been told has happened, although maybe not as much as some would like, in sort of the realm of sanctions and things like that.
Yeah, so I don't think so, right? I don't worry that international law is constraining U.S. action in this space. One, a lot of these efforts might be viewed as below the level of an armed attack, right? And even if they rise to the level of an armed attack, I think that credible case can be made that we're already under armed attack. If you believe that these responsive measures are armed attacks, then what's happening to us could be viewed as an armed attack, also depending on how you cast it. So that's number one. And so I don't worry that international law constrains it. And to be frank, we don't have to respond in cyberspace, right? To the extent that we believe that something is happening that we want to respond to, we have a range of measures we can utilize, right? One of the sort of, I think fetishes that we have about cyberspace is this idea that if something happens to us in cyberspace, we've got to respond in cyber. There's no reason that's the case, right? Moreover, nor do we need to have the kind of specificity of attribution that people seem to think. Because cyberspace is made of zeros and ones, we have this fetish that you have to know to an absolute certainty that it was the Russians or the North Koreans or the Chinese. The reality is we've never needed that when it comes to much more aggressive activities in the international realm. We bombed Libya back for the bombings against the Marines back in the day, right, at the discotheque. We did not have a tech cut of Muammar Gaddafi saying, go ordering that bombing. It was enough that we knew it was him. We attacked his facilities. We ended up killing his adopted daughter, if you recall, back in the 80s, right, which was terrible. But the point being, we've never worried about that for actual, full-on military operations, right? And yet we have the sense that we can't do it in cyberspace. Then the last point I'll make is, there's often also been this sort of policy objection, which is not really about international law, but about policy. So, we live in a glass house. We depend so much on the internet and on connected communications that, God forbid, we punch back in cyberspace, they're going to hit us so hard, it'll be crushing, right? The reality is we are at war in cyberspace today and have been for a long time. We've had billions, almost trillions of dollars taken out of our economy by the Chinese in terms of intellectual property. The Iranians and the North Koreans have both conducted actual destructive attacks on American soil against American private sector companies. The idea that we are not already at some level of war, and I understand that all the international lawyers will say, well, we're not really at war. I got it, right? We may not have had an armed attack, but we are effectively at war in this arena, and we ought to treat it as such, and we just haven't done that yet, because frankly, we don't have the guts to do it.
Well, thank you for that. And actually, as an opportunity to plug as well, Mika Oyang and I have a paper out that tries to categorize some of this stuff, right? What's cyber crime? What's cyber war? How should we think about these different thresholds? And Third Way has been great in convening some of those conversations, as have the various organizations with which you and Carrie are affiliated, and the American Society of International Law. So in the short time that remains, time always flies by in these kinds of discussions. Susan, I know you have some thoughts on what tech companies can do, because you've been talking a lot about government actors. So, could I turn the microphone to you to talk a little bit about the big tech companies, and then offer whatever concluding thoughts you'd like to squeeze in, and then we'll give also Jamil and Carrie each a little concluding thought moment before we wrap up here. So Susan.
I'd just like to remind us that in online, governments are not the only actors with enforcement capability. On the contrary, in some regards, private companies have more power than governments. In fact, Facebook on its own controls more human speech, more exercise of freedom of expression than any government has in the past or does in the present, including that of China, based on its control of billions of posts every day and its decision to take down between 1 and 2 million posts every day, not including spam. That is a system of censorship on an absolutely unimaginable scale. Companies like Facebook have been fending off responsibility to diminish harm on their platforms for a long time, by arguing not unreasonably that they are not producing that content, they're only hosting it. However, under lots of pressure from all kinds of actors in the United States and notably abroad, and under legal pressure abroad, the companies have greatly expanded their capacity to govern, to regulate. So I'd like to conclude by suggesting that they do that under law, that they follow international human rights law. And I suppose I'll chime in by also mentioning a paper I have forthcoming in the Yale Journal on Regulation that takes a crack at interpreting international law regarding speech for use by tech companies, particularly with a view to preventing major harm, which is what Article 20 of the ICCPR and other provisions attempt to do.
No, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, and we'll all look out for it. And also, I know you had a wonderful panel discussion at the recent ASIL 2020 virtual annual meeting, and I know that that discussion is available on demand to those who have access to the annual meeting videos. And so thank you for your work in this area, and we continue to look forward to seeing what you put out there, because it is such thoughtful commentary. Carrie, speaking of thoughtful commentators, what thoughts would you like to leave us with today?
I think it's that this conversation we have mostly focused on the upcoming US election, obviously, but foreign malign attempts to interfere in elections is an issue for democracies around the world. And much of what we were seeing, particularly when it comes from Russia and China, is not just an effort to disrupt and degrade American democracy, but it is a sustained effort to undermine democracies around the world and the freedom of citizens and self-government. And so I hope that one of the things that our policy communities and the international communities will be able to do more effectively in the future than perhaps we have in recent years is have more international cooperation and coordination to be able to have more of a united front against these efforts. I think countries are, and in the US, as we've discussed, even at the state and local level, fending for themselves. And it's an area where America is not alone in fending off these efforts to undermine our democracy. And there are other countries that are dealing with that are allies that we have traditional alliances with, and that hopefully we will have stronger alliances with in the future. But I think there's a real area for more cooperation and more of a united front, hopefully at some point down the road.
Well, thank you so much for raising that. And in fact, one of the upcoming episodes in this series that the American Society of International Law has put together will talk about multilateralism in international institutions. And I think that you really put your finger on a hugely important issue for us to confront. Jamil, parting thoughts.
Look, I think that the issues that Susan and Carrie both just raised are obviously critical and things that we have to take forward. I guess I would just talk briefly about the things we can do here at home. Susan raised the point about the role that tech companies play, and I think there is an important role for corporate America in this space, and frankly, the public sector and the private sector working together, which is to say, look, individual companies, individual states can't effectively defend themselves against these kind of threats, whether they're brought by a nation state or a sophisticated criminal attacker. They just have too many resources, too many monetary, human, and technical to really be effective. And so what you really have to do is create a collective defense capability. You have to have entities, states, localities, the federal government, the private sector working together on these issues. And even as Carrie points out, across international borders with allies, with companies that share our views on these issues. And that's not everybody. Let's be clear, the Russians, the Chinese have a very different view of this arena when it comes to cybersecurity. What they mean by cybersecurity is controlling their populations. We mean by cybersecurity is protecting our industries, protecting our democracies. And so there's a very different view of those things. But you can see a world in which where if these individual entities, these states, these companies, these industries are able to come together and sort of fight as one, which is to share information, collaborate in real time, you really can imagine an opportunity to effectively defend better. You won't be effective. You won't ultimately succeed necessarily, but you'll certainly be much better than we are today defending a loan individually. It's simply ineffective. I think the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report is exactly right that we need that sort of paradigm shift to a collective defense mentality. Problem is, as Carrie well knows, we've been talking about this for the better part of a decade, and we're not particularly much closer to that than we were back 10 years ago. We started talking about this. So I hope that's what we do going forward. But it's not just defense. We got to have offense. You've got to push back, and we just haven't done that. And leadership starts at the top, and frankly, we just don't have it right now.
Well, hopefully one way or another we'll get it either with a new administration or with an administration that sees the light on some of these issues that we've all been discussing. And thanks also for mentioning the Solarium Commission report that some of our viewers might also be interested in reading. So I hate to bring such a wonderful and fruitful conversation to a close, but all good things must come to an end. It's left to me just to thank you all so much for sharing your time, your expertise, your insights, to thank the American Society of International Law, the Program Committee, President Catherine Amirfar, Executive Director Mark Agrast. We really appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts with each other and with you, and please do continue to tune in to future segments on this series, and also to the wonderful resources that all of my guests are putting out through their own work and their organizations. Thanks so much, everybody.